Hi friends, welcome to SFI CUET guidance class series. So, SFI Delhi is providing this CUET guidances for those of you who are preparing for your CUET entrances. Some of you might have seen this page, some of you might have attended the previous sessions that we have uploaded in the page, and I am taking political science classes for you for CUET UG here. And so as of all of you know that for your CUET entrances, it is completely based on your NCERTs. The NCERT is the sole text that you should be religiously covering, so that like you attend every questions, because all the questions that has previously been there for the CUET entrance is completely based on the NCERT. And so here I will be briefly covering some of the chapters of NCERT which we feel is important for you to study for the entrances. And previously I have covered the Cold War era, which was a deleted chapter from the NCERT. For entrances, these deleted chapter questions can come from these deleted chapters also. So now I will be starting with the End of Bipolarity. It's the first chapter of the NCERT, and it also discusses about the period soon after the Cold War, after the disintegration of USSR. The chapter briefly discusses about the Soviet system, how USSR, the system of USSR existed, all these things. The chapter briefly discusses all these things, and then as the name suggests, it also suggests how this bipolar setup, with the end of this bipolar setup, things have changed. What all effects have been formed after disintegration of the USSR, what all effects did it reach to, all these things are discussed in the chapter. So, like in the NCERT textbook also you can see that like all the leaders of USSR has been mentioned. Small boxes of or the details of these leaders are mentioned. So I have made a small slide also here regarding the leaders of USSR. It's starting with Lenin, Vladimir Lenin, who was the founder of the Bolshevik Communist Party, who led the Russian Revolution in 1917. He is considered as a very great theoretician, a very great revolutionary. He was the founder and head of the Communist Party and the USSR in Russia. And soon after Lenin, then comes Stalin, who was the successor to Lenin, and he basically kick-started the industrialization of USSR, and he is known for the collectivization of agriculture. And Stalin is considered to be the one of a great leader because of his commanding commanding abilities during the Second World War. Basically, the Second World War ended with Soviet Union invading Germany and and defeating Germany in the war with the fall of Berlin. And Stalin was the leader of USSR during this period of time. He is seen as a very controversial leader with regards to this great terror of 1930, which is seen as the purges which happened in the Communist Party and all. So he is seen as a controversial leader of because of all this. And then there is Nikita Khrushchev, who came after Stalin. He introduced the peaceful coexistence program with US and with the West. And in Nikita Khrushchev, when we talk about Nikita Khrushchev, the most important thing that you should be remembering here was the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was the leader of USSR during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the negotiations between Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy, who was the president of US at that time, resulted in the peaceful disarmament of the situation at that time, because the situation led to an international crisis at that point of time. But then a nuclear war was in the purview, but then it didn't happen because of the negotiations which happened between these leaders. Then comes Leonid Brezhnev, who was the leader of USSR. He is known for the invasion of USSR in Afghanistan, and also Leonid Brezhnev, certain arms treaties are signed by Brezhnev. The SALT 1 and 2, the 2 rounds of SALT treaties were signed by Leonid Brezhnev, which is mentioned in the previous chapter of USSR of Cold War in NCERT. Then comes Gorbachev, who is the last leader of USSR. He is known for the perestroika and glasnost program is and the collapse of the Berlin Wall with the disintegration of USSR. Gorbachev was the leader who was the who at the point of disintegration of USSR, he was the leader of the Communist Party and USSR at that time. And after Gorbachev, it's Boris Yeltsin who was the first president of Russia. So after Gorbachev, USSR was no more, and it was Russia who succeeded USSR, who succeeded USSR position in the UN, who got all the recognitions of USSR, and Boris Yeltsin was the first president of Russia. And then like as we have discussed, the Union Soviet Socialist Republic came into being after the Socialist Revolution in Russia in 1917. The Russian Revolution was inspired by the ideals of socialism, communism, and it was opposed to capitalism. And the revolution like reflected a need for an egalitarian society. There has been a previous question from this part: when was the Russian Revolution happened? What was the time period? All these things has been asked earlier also. Then soon after the Russian Revolution, the USSR was formed under under the leadership of Lenin, and Lenin basically planned the state accordingly on lines of on the lines of Marxist-Leninism and all. And then Lenin, it was a planned economy. It was run by the state. Primary ownership of the property was given to the state, and it was centered around the Communist Party. USSR basically at the soon after the Second World War, the USSR built up the USSR rose to as a superpower, as an economic and military superpower. And then the world basically divided into two power blocks, which was discussed in the Cold War era, and which made the Cold War and all happen at that time. And this USSR built up a socialist bloc in which a lot of nations who support USSR was brought into alliance with them, and that's how the socialist bloc is considered. So then the certain pacts that should be remembered here is the Warsaw Pact, which is also discussed in the Cold War era. You can go through that video and you can see the details in that. So discussing about USSR, there was this particular mention about the Soviet system in NCERT. So what is the Soviet system? Soviet system is basically the planned economic model that Soviet Union showed soon after the revolution in the nation building of USSR. They showed up a planned economic model in which free healthcare, free education was given. There was no unemployment. A major ownership of property was by the state, and everything that was produced in the Soviet Union was basically under the state's purview, and it was everything was everything considered to be in a planned economic model. So it consisted of 15 republics. Berlin collapsed in the USSR consisted of 15 republics. We will not be discussing much about the Cold War era in this video because I have already discussed it in the previous video. So after the Soviet system, we will be discussing about the collapse of USSR, which started with the which could be seen after the fall of Berlin Wall, which in 1989, which is seen as the symbol of the disintegration of USSR. So in 1979, Soviet invaded Afghanistan, and this was European part of USSR need freedom, but not the European Eastern European nations, which was in support of USSR, and the European parts, the nations which was part of the USSR, they were demanding for freedom. But coming to the Central Asian countries, which was also part of USSR, they didn't want to secede from the Soviet Socialist Republic. But then eventually with the disintegration, all of these nations were disintegrated into separate independent nations. Boris Yeltsin became the first president of Russia, and in 1991 December, in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, these three declared USSR got dismantled, and Commonwealth of Independent States came into being with democracy and capitalism as new policies. Russia succeeded the seat of USSR in UN. Nuclear weapon of USSR got it in the hands of Russia. All international treaties and commitments by USSR will be kept up by Russia. So basically, Russia succeeded USSR with all the other treaties and everything, and all the other nations which was part of USSR became the Commonwealth of Independent States. So after the disintegration of USSR, the bipolar setup of the world changed into a unipolar world, making US as the sole power of the world basically. So US became the sole power, and what happened here was the World Bank and the IMF became the financial advisor to the newly formed countries. So basically, US were pushing forward capitalism and liberal tendencies. US capitalism and democracy became the economic and political life of the newly formed independent countries, which also joined NATO later on. A lot of countries which was part of USSR even had to join NATO later on. So then there is the mention of the shock therapy, which is also mentioned in NCERT. So soon after the collapse of USSR, soon after the which was seen as a downfall of communism, and there was a shock therapy was followed in most of these countries. Like that is the system of the economic system, the political system that was existing in these communist countries were changed into a democratic capitalist system setup with the help of the World Bank and the IMF. This is known as the shock therapy. Basically, here the newly independent states were demanded to make their markets open and free trade. They were demanded to make this laissez-faire state possible, and all these states were changed to a laissez-faire model, and this is seen as the shock therapy. So private ownership became the dominant ownership mode of ownership in the shock therapy, and even Russia also went on with privatizing its own industries and everything. 90% of Russia's industries started privatizing, and the largest garage sale in history is considered to be during this time of disintegration and all. And the value of Russian currency declined a lot. The value of ruble declined a lot. And after that, the Central Asian countries which were part of USSR earlier, the presidents of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan appointed themselves to power first for 10 years and then extended it to another 10 years also. So they allowed no dissent or opposition, and democracy got toppled in most of the newly independent states with this kind of a shock therapy treatment. So the consequences, there has been a lot of different consequences with the disintegration of USSR. Most countries got revived, even though there was a lot of economic consequences faced by a lot of Central Asian countries, because most of these Central Asian countries their economy was supported by the USSR economy. They were supported by the Russian economy, but then with the collapse of USSR, with the disintegration of it, most of these nations came to an economic crisis also. So these nations revived their economies after 2004 to some extent. And in Russia, what happened was that after the disintegration of USSR, certain regions started showing great secessionist tendencies, like Chechnya and Dagestan. There was violent secessionist movements rising from these areas, and in Central Asia, Tajikistan witnessed a civil war that went on for 10 years till 2001. In Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia split peacefully into two, that's to the Czech Republic and the Slovak, forming independent different countries of this. And then so that's regarding the major consequences. And coming to India's relationship in all this is that India-Russia relations, basically 80 bilateral agreements signed between India. There was soon after the disintegration, 80 bilateral agreements were signed between India and Russia in 2001. Russia supporting India claim on Russia basically supported India's claim on the Kashmir issue, and India is the second largest consumer of arms from Russia. Russia also gave cryogenic rocket during India's need. So these are the some of the consequences that can be read out from the disintegration of USSR. Basically, with the disintegration of USSR, India lost a big ally, because USSR has been a major ally for India during the period when it existed. So after that, India had to also liberalize its economy. India was not a completely open economy till then. So, but in after 1990, the disintegration of USSR, India had to liberalize its economy also. Similarly, in the other nations where the communist countries where the disintegration of USSR affected, the World Bank and IMF were playing a major role in making their economic system change to a capitalist mode, liberalize their economy, privatize their economy, and similar ways in India also the World Bank and IMF got involved in the economy. So these all can be seen as the consequences of the disintegration. So that's it regarding the first chapter regarding the end of bipolarity. In after this, there is the contemporary centers of power, in which organizations like the European Union, ASEAN, and the rise of China, South Korea, Japan as other centers of power is discussed. It's also a very important chapter. There can be a lot of questions from these portions, especially from the portions of Cold War, because there has been a lot of events, a lot of factual information should be remembered here, because in Cold War a lot of factual questions can come from this portion. So do well in your preparations. All the best for everyone who is writing CUET UG classes, and I request everyone to follow our channel, and also if you find these classes beneficial for you, useful for you, please share it with your friends. And thanks from SFI Delhi, and all the best for all of you who is preparing for CUET.